We're on 188, page 188, the second to last paragraph on that page. Ravina said, the Ravina Amar. Still dealing with the rights of workers, and made the connection a couple of weeks ago to also beast of burden, how you treat your workers, how you treat your animals, connecting the two, and what are the responsibilities of the employer, the owner. And specifically we're talking about eating produce while you're working. And they divide it here now into two types of produce. Produce that's loose on the ground, that's just fallen, and produce that's attached to the tree that you can actually pick and eat. So that's where I'm at right now. Ravina, page 188, it's verse 9. Ravina Amar. Lo adam talush v'lo shor b'chumbar tzrichei krai. So you actually don't need scriptural proof for either a human being eating from loose produce or an ox eating from attached produce. You don't need a verse. And here I'll quote a verse to show that you don't need a verse. What I guess what they really mean there is it doesn't have to be said explicitly, that it's easy to derive it from a different verse. Dichtiv, as it's written, lo tachsom shor b'disho, it's that you shouldn't muzzle an ox as it is threshing, in the act of threshing. Last week I had to look up the word threshing because I'm not a farmer. A lot of you I know are. But so now we know what threshing is. But generally, so by the way, so threshing would prove that that an ox can eat loose stuff because it's already loose. It's already been picked, and it's just stuff lying on the ground. And the ox is threshing it, so it can eat little bits of grain. That's the effect of the muzzle. The muzzle doesn't prevent him from eating, and you're not allowed to muzzle your ox while he's threshing. So we do a little exegetical trick here. Mikdi. Kol mile di nu b'chasima di alpinan shor mi Shabbat. Okay, so we've learned, and everyone knows, that it doesn't just refer to the ox, right? Just by the Torah using the word ox, it refers to any beast of burden. You're not allowed to muzzle any beast of burden. How do we know that? Because when we're given the Shabbat commandments, which tell us that you have to allow your ox to rest also on Shabbat. Remember, the Shabbat commandments are directed at the landowner. You have to rest yourself, but you also have to allow your employees to rest and also your ox to rest. So we know there it doesn't only mean ox. We know that ox there stands in for every animal, including your horse, your donkey. So we know that from Shabbat. So therefore, we know that the muzzling thing refers not just to the ox, but refers to animals. So therefore, you didn't actually need the word ox there, because we already know from the word ox that it refers to all animals. Im kein lichtov rachmana lo tadush b'chasima. So the Torah could have said, notice by the way that they call the Torah Rahmana, which means the merciful one, but that's their word. I talked about that last time. That's their word for Torah. Lo tadush b'chasima. The Torah could easily have written and had the same effect of, just as you don't muzzle don't muzzle while the animal, you don't need the word animal even in the Hebrew there. So don't muzzle during the act of threshing. You didn't actually need the word ox, because ox is a stand-in for all animals. So you could have left it out, and it would have been understood that it refers to all animals. Sure, dichtav rachman alamali. So why did it insert the unnecessary word sure, which means ox? Now here's a key moment here. It's a key moment in this whole discussion, where they've been playing around with this for a long time. Now they're finally deciding la'akushe chosem lenechzam, to make a connection between the muzzled and the muzzler. So the muzzled is the beast, and the muzzler is a human being. So the reason you have the word ox there is to make an essential connection between a human being and a beast. So now that's the end of the discussion. We've laid the intellectual groundwork that we are now allowed to compare humans and animals when it comes to field work. And you're allowed to derive one from the other. Now, as we went through this discussion, there was some hesitation to do that, because after all, they're not the same thing. An animal and a beast are not the same thing. There, in fact, may be essential differences, which would tell us that you can't compare the two. So don't even try. Don't even think by looking at the rules for treating your workers, you learn anything about the rules from treating your animals, or vice versa, because human beings and animals are so different that you can't make those comparisons. So we've gone through, and in fact, they suggested that. They were at the end of that argument. We really are, where they're rejecting that argument and saying, in fact, there is an essential connection between beasts of burden and animals working in the field, and we can learn one from the other. So what does that teach you sort of about the ideology of the Talmud when it comes to the differences and the similarities between animals and human beings. So it teaches you that they're more connected than you might think.
Yeah. In some areas.
Yeah, in some areas, yeah. At least for this. But to me, it goes deeper than that. So to me, it's actually, because there's two ways of looking at it. And I've talked about this before. You can look at life as being on a continuum from single-celled structures to human beings at the very end, but all part of the same continuum. This is life, where everything is recognizable within the same continuum. That's one way of looking at life. Or you could look at life as, you have the single-celled organisms to animals, and then you have human beings. They're sort of off in the stratosphere. They're not even on the continuum. They're not recognizable as part of the same thing. And the Talmud, I think, is saying here, it's a continuum. It's not human beings off and radical and totally different. That you can't compare. An animal has pain just like a human being has pain. An animal has obligations just like human beings have obligations. It's just a question of degree and not kind.
It gives emphasis to the use of the word Rahmana, merciful.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah, so when it comes to mercy for the things that are working for you,
right,
we're going to treat them the same. But I think the implications are more far-reaching. Mm-hmm. I just saw something, I'll say this real quickly, and that this is an interest of mine, but there was a thing on NPR I was driving that actually was not about Donald Trump. It was very interesting. I was very surprised, and I was going to change the station because, of course, I have to hear about Donald Trump all the time. But I decided to, I resisted temptation. I was listening to the story. It was about something called a chimera. I think it's pronounced chimera. It's not chimera. Chimera.
Yeah, right.
It's, did you hear the thing on NPR?
No, we just know what they are for biologists.
Oh, for biology, yeah. So you're biologist. Why don't you explain it?
No, you can't.
Do you want to explain it?
It's a mix of two two DNAs bringing unnaturally two.
Right. So it started with there was actually a woman who was meant to be a twin, and the other one died. So it was a chimera. It was like a mixed DNA, because identical twins, can be, it's supposed to split and turn into two separate human beings. But this one, it didn't actually. So she became, what was she really? So she was going to doctors and scientists.
Through the son's blood testing, they had the DNA of the father, not the mother, and she was definitely the mother of the two boys.
Yeah. So anyway, so you said you're a chimera. It's two human beings that have been fused, and then the story goes into, so you try it with donkeys or with horses and mules, and they've done experiments with it, and then of course the question is, what about a human being and a horse? And what about just to harvest organs, or so you make a cow, but you make a cow with a human liver, with that technology, which it's not a matter of time before you'll be able to do that. But then it brings in this essential question. So is there, if you're going to do a human being and a cow, let's say, you do it in a laboratory, what are you creating? And then is there something really unique about a human being, or really is it all just life and you can manipulate it and you have to come up with rules? But it creates this philosophical conundrum of what is the place of the human in the world among other living beings? And of course I always add machines to this too, because we're coming to the place where we're going to create artificially intelligent machines, and what is the place of those machines in this whole structure that we call living things? And anyhow, the Talmud, I think, makes an astonishing conclusion here, which really is that when it says La kushi chosem lenechsam v'nechsam lechosem, we are connecting the muzzler to the muzzled and the muzzle to the muzzler. We're saying, at least in this case, we are going to connect them. We're going to see them as essentially related, and therefore you could make that. You could do it for other categories, including other ethical categories. And last time we talked a bit about just like animal experimentation. If we all understand that it's unethical to experiment on human beings for drugs and stuff like that, then why is it ethical to experiment on animals for these things, which causes the animals lots of pain, and you kill the animals? And so, people have answers to that. I have a friend who's a philosopher who says that it's clearly ethically okay, but you can't really explain it other than we can do it. Like we have the ability, and you're allowed to operate within kinship. Just the idea that I feel more kinship to you as a human being than I do to those rats. But that's a pretty slippery ethical argument. Anyway, I'm not getting into all that right now. Right now, that the Talmud is making this connection. At least when it comes to field work, you treat them as the merciful one wants us to be merciful both to the animal and to the human being. God's mercy extends to animals and to human beings, and wants our mercy to extend in the same way. Yeah.
I just want to say it's really a big discussion at the moment because of GMO, the genetically modified organisms. And this week they're talking about whether they should put this gene into mosquitoes to make them sterile, to get rid of, so we're going to wipe out mosquitoes. And is it right to wipe out a whole...
The chance of us wiping out mosquitoes is zero.
Yeah, I know, but it's an ethical thing as well. Can you start wiping out species you don't like?
Right.
Well,
We've done that with polio.
All right, we'll take one more comment because then we'll get back to Ron.
So back to Talmud.
Yeah.
I want to think in terms of how the rabbis thought.
Yeah.
So they weren't aware of evolution. They didn't.
Of what?
Evolution.
Yeah.
I don't think they weren't aware.
That's right. They were not. No, they would have figured that human beings were created as distinct.
Correct.
Yeah.
So on what basis did they come up with this ethical philosophy, which resonates with us because
because of evolution.
That's what resonates to me. We're part of the same continuum. How did it become a continuum?
It's a good question. So what I think, my theory, it's just my theory, who knows really, but my theory is that they had closer relationships with animals. I mean, their day-to-day experience, because it's a farming society, their day-to-day experience was, seeing the face of the cow every day, seeing the face of the chickens, and they were with them. They knew them all the time. They could tell when they felt pain. They could tell when they felt longing.
And they didn't have a factory farm.
Right, there were no factory farms. So that connection created a greater sense of kinship than we have. We who are totally removed from animals, except for our own pets. So that's why a lot of people who have no problem with animal experimentation or with eating meat, would say, well, but it's different with my cat. My cat is basically human. And I want everybody to treat my cat like it's my daughter. Whereas they'll eat a cow but for ancient people, not just the rabbis, for ancient people, there wasn't a big difference between the cow and the dog and the cat because you were with them all the time. I think. I mean, that's just my theory. Because you get a bit of it from ancient writings too, where they actually did assume human emotions for a lot of their farm animals.
I think there's a mindset, even before writing. In the hunter-gatherers, maybe 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, they would pray and make a prayer that they had to sacrifice the animal so that they could eat it.
Right. So Native Americans have some of that too. So you thank the chicken, before you eat it, and thank you. Yeah, thanks. Great. yeah, thank you.
I like the sign. I like the sign of a cow riding, on the billboard and writing "Eat chicken."
Yes, that's right.
We talked about Terry yesterday. So his life depended on his cow.
Right.
So
his horse. Right. Yeah.
Or horse. So they should appreciate the animals in a different way.
Yeah.
What's that? And the milk, right?
Yeah. Right. No, that's a good example. Yeah. Okay. So once we know that the muzzler, which is the human being, can eat attached produce. So the muzzled, which is the animal, and just as the muzzled can eat from the loose stuff, and also the muzzler. So making this essential linkage, right? To no Rabbanan. All right. So now that we've established that, we're actually. It's easier to come up with all sorts of rights of workers, what they can eat, what they can, and and also the limitations to that too, because there are limits. Like you don't want to hire a worker and just say go at it. You'll hire a worker in a store and suddenly they can eat everything. So there's got to be limits to it, but it's hard to figure out those limits from Scripture. However, once you're allowed to use the rules about animals, you can actually understand a lot more. You can get more specificity in what exactly are the rights and the limits to the worker partaking of the whatever the industry is. So Tano Rabbanan, rabbis taught dayash. So dayash, of course, means treading, to tread. Ma dayash miyuchad. So what's unique about dayash? Once we know about the rule for threshing, which is that you can eat the loose food, we already know that. So let's think about threshing for a second. What is unique about it? Davar shekidule karka. Well, first of all, it's stuff that comes out of the ground. The origin is the ground, right? It's wheat, right? As opposed to things like butter. But other kind of produce doesn't come from the ground. So what we know about it is that it comes from the ground. Like apples. You pick it from the ground. Uvishat gemar malacha. Okay, and actually threshing, when it comes to tithing, is at the end stage of its produce, right? I mean, you actually don't tithe it. Let me forget about tithing for a second. It's worthless until you thresh, because you're not eating the stalks of grain. You're eating the grains, right? So threshing actually completes and makes it a recognizable product. That's what you're going to sell in the marketplace, okay? Ufo elochelbo, and also a worker is allowed to eat it. So therefore, that's what we know about. We know that for sure. How do we know that from oxen? But we know for sure that that's the case for threshing. So therefore we learn kol shegidule karka. So now we learn everything that grows from the ground. Poel chelba. We know that a worker, like an animal, we know a worker can eat anything that grows from the ground. Now, what does that eliminate? Because we're more interested, because we actually already knew that. But we want to know what are the limitations. Yatsa. What it eliminates is hacholev, someone who milks cows. Because you might think it's the same thing for milking cows. Drink as much as you want. But they're saying no. There are certain tasks that the worker is not allowed to eat whatever they want. Cholev hamechabetz is someone who makes butter. You're churning. Isn't that? I'm so removed from this stuff. It's like fourth grade. Yeah, right. Fourth grade, I remember learning about churning butter. But so you've got hamechabetz is someone who makes butter. Hamigaben. That's an easy word to translate because it's got gvina on it. So somebody who makes cheese.
Cheesemaker.
She'en gidulei karka. That stuff doesn't grow from the ground. Ve'ein poel chilbo. A worker can't eat from that. So that's the conclusion so far. Lamali. So why do you even need that? We've got this verse. Ki tavo v'cherem re'echa nafka. We could learn it from the whole idea of a worker eating starts with the line, whoever comes into a vineyard. So clearly, you don't need actually to go back to the ox to prove that a human being can eat that produce and not the milk, because we already have that. The whole thing in the Torah tells us it takes place in a vineyard and then later in a field, and that already eliminates the idea of someone eating milk. But let's keep going. Eats tarich. No, you need it. Salkadatcha amina, because you might think. That's very common in the Talmud. The Talmud will say you needed to know what I just told you because in your error. And in your faulty reasoning, you might think the following. So whatever I'm telling you right now, remember, that's why it's hard in the Talmud. Whatever I'm telling you right now is wrong. Even though it's going to be very convincing, it's wrong because otherwise because it says you might think. Well, you only might think if it's reasonable to think so. So you might think the following wrong thing. This. O'il k'tiv kama, because later, remember, it says standing grain. Remember, it says it twice. Lirabot kobale kama, because that includes everything, every kind of standing grain, not just wheat, but any kind of standing grain. Literabot nami midi delav gidale karkaninu. You might also think it includes, because remember you had the word kama twice. So one time we studied that and we figured, okay, well it means that he can eat stuff that's attached and stuff that's loose. But they're saying there's another, in your mistaken reasoning, you might think the reason it has the word kama, standing grain, twice is once to include produce that comes from the ground, and the other to include everything else. And the everything else might be milk and butter and cheese. So you might think that, because after all, we do that. We do interpret second words, extraneous words. Okay. Kamash balan. So it teaches us don't do that, because we already know from oxen that human beings are only allowed to eat produce that grows and not things like milk and cheese, stuff like that. Okay. And that's kind of the end of the... So that's the end of it, by the way. So if you have a job milking or making cheese or butter and things like that, you aren't allowed to eat from it. Okay. Tanya idach, dayash. So again, we're going to go back from this whole threshing, that the ox is allowed to eat the loose grain. So ma dayash miyuchad. Let's look at threshing again. Another analysis of threshing. Devar shebisha'at gebar malacha poel chelba. So it's something that in the final stages of its production, the worker is allowed to eat from it. I guess workers would eat pieces of grain. They wouldn't eat it in the beginning of the work, right? Because just taking it off the stalk, there's no way you can eat it. There's a sense that you could eat it at the threshing, so you can't actually eat it until it's at the final stage. Okay, which is here they're calling the final stage threshing. I'll just introduce this idea too. You might disagree that the final stage of a grain's journey to the marketplace is threshing. What would be another way of saying it?
Well, I was going to say it's a flour.
Yeah, exactly, because people generally don't eat raw grain. I mean, you might even say it's not till it's a loaf of bread that it's actually in its final stage. Even flour is not actually its final stage.
Right.
Yeah. But here they're throwing out that at the final stage, that's when a human being is allowed to eat it, because an ox is allowed to eat it. But let me go on. Af kol shehu b'sha'at gemar malacha poelo chelba. So you might then conclude that everything that's at its final stage, whatever that means, of being a product, a worker can eat it. And what would that exclude? By the way, that includes a lot of things then.
Include bread.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. It may include bread. Because bread starts as something that grows from the ground. And it might be the worker who bakes the bread, right? Or the worker who sells it. Now, here, they're not necessarily going there. But what they want to do is eliminate the following. Yatsa, haminakesh b'shumim uvtsalim. Weeding. So the weed, you go and you weed. So that's in no way is that the final stage. Weeding is something you have to do constantly all the time. It's never the final stage of production. So if your job is to weed and you see some nice looking onions, they actually use onions or garlic as an example, you're not allowed to eat them. I mean, you may not want to because they're not quite ripe, but maybe you find something that's ripe. You're not allowed to eat them because your job is not involved in the final stage of production. And it's only workers whose job is involved in the final stage of production who are allowed to eat. Okay, that's a limitation that they're suggesting. Okay. Ho ilva en gemar malacha, because it's not the end of production. Ein poelo chel bahem. That's the suggestion. Okay. Okay. Now, lama li. So why do we even need that? We already know that. It's going to be the same pattern again. We already know it from the following verse. Mi ve'el kelyecha lo tite nafka. So we already know that it's limited to the final stage of production, meaning harvest, the harvest time, because we have that verse that says you can go and you can eat whatever's in the field, but you can't take it and put it in your bucket. The very idea that you can't take it and put it in your bucket tells us that's harvest time, because you're not going to go and take stuff and put it in your bucket that's not ripe yet. So the verse that says you can't take it, put it in your bucket, take it home with you, can only refer to harvest time. So from that verse, we already know that the license to eat must only refer to the end of production and not harvest time. So you don't actually need that, what I just said before. That would already eliminate weeding. However, you do need it. Lo tzricha, afal gav de kamishalev ketine b'beini alime. Because in the act of weeding, you actually may find ripe things that you want to eat.
Right.
For instance, your owner might tell you, your boss, the boss man might tell you, I want you to take away all those little onions that are we're going to call the little onions weeds, because they're not worth anything. And they allow the bigger onions, and they're taking, the soil from the bigger onions. So the worker might say to himself, okay, well, I can eat those little onions, right? Wrong, you can't. Yes, so you have to bring them in, and maybe you can sell them, maybe you can do something with them, and those little onions would be in the final stage. So since you might think that, we actually need the other verse to tell us that you can't. That's how we know from that other verse that you can only eat things. The worker can only eat things at their final stage. Then it takes us a while to think about what final stage is, because like for apples, that really is the final stage. The last thing of their growing is picking. That's all you need to do. Once they're picked, you can take them to market. Wheat's are more complicated, because wheat, grain, things like that, they're more complicated because they do require extra production. Threshing, but like I said before, threshing's not even the last thing. Okay.
But little onions could be at their end stage.
You could eat them. So that's right. So the point they're saying is that you can't. You might think that you can eat them, but actually you can't. Why? Because they're still at their final stage. They're still at their final stage, and we know from a previous verse that they're at the final stage. Okay.
That's arbitrary.
Yeah, it's arbitrary. Yeah.
It's always the thing about a smear of butter. If a guy's making butter or milking cows, and he wants to take a sip of milk,
well, yes, you could say it's arbitrary, except that we have explicit verses saying it's from stuff that grows.
From the Talmud.
Yes,
it's arbitrary. These guys.
So, but yeah, yes, it's not quite arbitrary, because they're using their own, right. They're using their own interpretive techniques to prove it. So it's not quite arbitrary. At the same time, from the point of view of the landowner, there does have to be some limit, right? I think that it can't just be free range, so to speak. It's not right, but it just can't be. You can't just be able to take everything. I remember I had a job one time in college where I worked at a donut shop, and
they had donuts.
Donut holes.
Well, So, it was Sunday morning, and, when you're in college, like, early Sunday morning is like 11 o'clock, you're schlepping yourself out of bed. And so they told me exactly how many donuts I could eat. And, it couldn't just be like, eat however many you want. So that was fine. Okay, so I had exactly the amount I could eat. However, I would, of course, have lots of friends that would come in. And that was a little less clear, like how many I could give to them for free. And very often my friends would kind of make up the rule as they went along. And it was quite awkward after a while, too, because I also was getting... I forgot. I got a set amount, but someone at some point was going to count, like how many donuts did we start with and how many do we end with. And... So there has to be some limits to how much the worker can get. So they're trying to figure. So you can call it arbitrary, but they're also trying to establish some limits. Maybe it's just to harvest stuff. I mean, after all, the workers aren't going to starve. You're paying the workers. Okay.
Did you have an extra donut?
That's the 13th.
I don't really remember that being the problem. And this is just my memory. I think that they gave me enough that I didn't really want more. Remember, there's a point where you don't want more.
Yeah,
but the issue was the friends who came.
Yeah.
My dad used to make ice cream.
Yeah.
And the rule was for employees, eat as much as you want.
That's right.
Because you knew that
There's only so much you could eat.
you could eat so much.
The more you eat, probably the less you want.
All right, let's just finish this a little bit, and then we'll close up for today. So we're on number 191, verse 5. Tanya Irach. So another possible teaching. Daish, which is a threshing. Ma daish miuchad. Again, so now analyzing threshing and what's unique about it, so we can extrapolate from it. Devar shaloding b'ramalachto l'maser. That in fact it doesn't complete the work when it comes to tithing. It doesn't. So you don't tithe at the threshing floor. You tithe after you've threshed and you've brought the bundles to your storehouse. That's when you tithe. So poel ochelbo, and a worker eats from it. So we're going to look at af kol shaloding b'ramalachto l'maser. So anything where the work is not completed when it comes to tithing, poel ochelbo. Anything where the production may be at the end stage of its own production, but it's not at the end stage when it comes to tithing. Anything like that, that's what a worker can eat, and that would exclude habodel bitmarim, separating dates, uvegrugot, or dried figs, ho'il v'nigmara malachto l'maser, because that's actually that's what completes the work for tithing. Ein poel ochelba. Okay, so it's when you're picking the dates, eat as many as you want. Okay, even when you're washing them off. But when you're separating them, the good ones from the bad ones, really kind of making them set for market, that's when you tithe. At that point, you can't eat them. Okay, that's the suggestion. Now, I'll end with this. So this is Vehatanya, but we have another teaching. Habodel b'tmarim uvagrugot poel chelbo. We have a teaching that says explicitly, those people who are separating figs and dates, they're allowed to eat. So we've just learned that they're not. All right, so next week we'll deal with that contradiction.
Now that you've learned
So I was thinking